The medbot cleared me 3 times before it accepted that I was not a medical emergency. The second scan, it called a supervisor. The third scan, the supervisor called Vreth. Vreth looked at my file, looked at me and said, "Earth native." I said yes. They sent me to my bunk. That was my introduction to Proxima Station 7, and it set the tone for everything that followed. The intake hall smelled like recycled air, and something faintly sweet I could not identify right away. I learned later it was a Velhari comfort pheromone, pumped into the atmospheric system because the majority of this cycle's cadets were Velhari, and the station administrators had decided that a calm intake process was worth the adjustment. It made the whole corridor smell like the inside of a very clean candle shop. The temperature was set to Velhari-comfortable, thin air, slightly cool, mildly pressurized, like a large hardware store in November. Fine by me. The check-in desk was staffed by a human named Owen. 30-something, brown hair going gray at the temples, the posture of someone who had sat at this particular desk long enough that his spine had reached a private agreement with the chair. He scanned my credentials, looked at me, looked at his intake list, and then looked at me again in the way of someone quietly doing a count. "Kowalksik," he said. "Mara, Earth native, Lake Erie District." "That's me," I said. He typed something that took longer than it should have and did not explain why. He handed me my access card and I moved on. The medbot was at Station 3. Standard full-body intake scan, bone density, organ function, baseline vitals, all of it. I stood on the platform and let it work. It was quiet for about 4 seconds after the scan completed, which was longer than I expected. Then it made a sound I can only describe as cautious beeping. "Cadet," it said, "your resting cortisol baseline is elevated above standard parameters for a non-emergency intake environment." "Okay," I said. "Your resting heart rate is 44 beats per minute." "Sure," I said. "Your bone density registers in the 93rd percentile for your age group. Your scar tissue distribution suggests repeated physical stress exposure across a long period of time. Have you recently survived a high lethality planetary event?" I thought about the winter the Erie heating grid went down for 4 weeks straight. I thought about the summer the air quality dropped to class red for 11 consecutive days, and you could not go outside without a filtration mask. I thought about the pressure incident at the factory when I was 16. The sound it made, the way the smoke moved, the way everything was organized differently afterward. "I'm from Cleveland," I said. The medbot had no record of Cleveland as a designated disaster zone. It sat with this information for 2 full seconds. It cleared me. My assigned barracks pod was on Deck 4, and I was the last one to arrive. All 5 bunks were already occupied, and all 5 occupants turned to look at me at the exact same moment, with the synchronized precision of people who had not spent much time around humans and were not entirely sure what to expect from one. It was either a welcome or an examination. Based on the expressions, it was mostly the second one. SS Sen was on the bunk nearest the door. Velhari, tall, gray-skinned, with eyes the dark color of a bruise that moved independently of each other the way a bird's do, tracking separate things at once. Velhari are empathic, not mind-readers. It is not that clean or that simple. They read biochemical states the way you and I read a face. Cortisol, adrenaline, serotonin, the full chemistry of a person. SS Sen looked at me for a moment, and something shifted in their expression into a register I did not have a name for yet. GRX occupied the 2 middle bunks, Korathi, hive adjacent, which meant 3 individual cognitive entities sharing one body and speaking in plural and occasionally disagreeing with themselves mid-sentence in a way that was disconcerting until you got used to it and then was merely interesting. Their first words to me were, "We are GRX, we are pleased, we are uncertain." I appreciated the coverage. Oa-Leth was on the top bunk at the far end. Ithani, light-framed, gold-toned skin that caught light differently depending on the angle, a photosynthetic species that could eat solid food but ran primarily on ambient light as a fuel source. Their first comment was not a greeting but an assessment of the pod's lighting quality, which they rated as insufficient. I said the lighting seemed fine to me. Oa-Leth looked at me with the expression of someone who has heard something so far outside normal experience that no immediate response feels adequate. The fifth cadet, Vel, was Dur-Rathi and said nothing to me for 3 full days, which I respected enormously. At 1800, Drill Commander Vreth came in. Vreth moved like someone who had made a decision early in life that energy was finite and should not be spent on unnecessary motion. Their species was listed in my intake paperwork as classification, pending, which was apparently diplomatic shorthand for a conversation the Academy had decided not to keep having. Vreth looked at each of us in sequence. When they reached me, the pause was exactly 1 second longer than it had been for anyone else. Not obvious, noticeable if you were watching for it. I was watching. This cycle's training environment, Vreth said, will simulate Class 3 atmospheric volatility across all outdoor and semi-exposed modules. Review your assigned survival protocols before 0600. Class 3 atmospheric volatility. I watched the 2 Velhari cadets in the front row exchange a look that carried considerable information without containing a single word. One of them made a small sound at the back of their throat, not a word, just a sound, the kind that travels across species because the feeling behind it is the same in every language. I wrote Class 3 in my notes. Underneath it I wrote, "Is there coffee in the common area?" There was. It tasted like someone had received a detailed written description of coffee from a source that had never personally encountered coffee and had done their best with that information. I drank 2 cups. I would drink them every morning for 4 months and never stop being mildly let down by it. That night, SSN sat on the edge of their bunk and watched me unpack with the focused attention of someone conducting important research. "You are human," SSN said. "I am," I said. "Earth native. Born and raised." A pause with weight in it. "Your biochemistry," SSN said carefully, "is unusual." I looked up from my bag. "Most cadets on their first night register at least low-grade anxiety," SSN said. "New environment, new assignment, new cohort. It is standard, expected, physiologically normal." "Sure," I said. "You do not." I considered this. I looked around the pod, the thin, cool air, the perfectly controlled pressure, the temperature that was consistent and reliable and went exactly where it was supposed to go. I tried to locate the feeling of being afraid of this and came up with nothing. "I've slept in worse places," I said. It was true. I finished unpacking and was in my bunk by 2100. I learned from SSN much later, delivered with the expression of someone sharing information they found genuinely troubling, that while I slept, my cortisol baseline had dropped so low the barracks health monitor had flagged it as a possible sensor malfunction. The sensor was fine. That was just what I looked like when I was comfortable. SSN lay awake for 2 more hours after that, trying to figure out what kind of world produced a person whose body treated a military training station as a rest spa. I slept like a rock. Dad would have thought this was something. The storm drill started at 3 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was already half awake when it began, not from nerves but from habit. My body has a complicated relationship with 3 in the morning that goes back to the eerie winters when the heating was unreliable and you woke before the cold did. So when the alarm started, I was already sitting up. I had it identified before the announcement finished. Low pressure event alarm. Single tone pulse, 3-second interval. Not fire, not hull breach, not medical. Atmospheric. I pulled on my boots and stood up. SSN was still reaching for their bunk frame. GRX was making a sound like a jar of coins being shaken. Oa-Leth had not moved at all, which I later learned was because Ethani have a brief cognitive lag in sudden wake situations that looks alarming until you know it is completely normal. Vel was up and dressed in 40 seconds flat, which made me immediately revise my assessment of them upward. The announcement finished informing us. Class 3, Atmospheric Simulation, Full Protocol, Evacuation to Designated Shelter Stations, all cadets to move immediately. I was in the corridor before the word immediately finished. The hallway was already a situation. Velhari cadets from the adjacent pods were moving in tight, fast clusters. They draw together under stress by instinct, and 6 of them in a corridor designed for 4-wide traffic created a bottleneck that was going to slow everyone down. I went low, shoulder to the wall, moved through the gap on the left side. The pressure drop hit at corridor junction 7. It was not real, this was a simulation. The station's atmospheric controls dialing down pressure in the exercise zones to 4% below standard, but 4% is enough to notice. Your ears register it first. Then your chest, a slight tightness, nothing serious, but the kind of sensation that your brain files under this is not right and starts sending signals upward. I felt it, noted it, kept moving. Behind me, I heard the sound of a Velhari cadet stopping completely. Just stopping. Mid-corridor, feet planted, breathing shifting into a pattern that was getting faster and shallower, and was not going to help anyone. 2 of their cohort mates reached them and pulled, and for a moment there were 3 Velhari cadets and a corridor and a pressure differential and a problem. I am not going to pretend I stopped out of pure kindness. I stopped because they were in my way. Move toward the wall, I said. Not loud, loud does not help in a pressure situation. It just adds to the noise. Firm and directed. The Velhari cadet looked at me with wide violet eyes, the look I was starting to recognize, the one that said the person looking was trying to place me in a category and failing. Wall, I said again. Single file, I know where the shelter station is. Follow me or don't, but move. They moved. I did know where the shelter station was. I had memorized the station layout the first afternoon I arrived, the same way I had memorized the exit routes in every building I had lived in since I was old enough to understand that exits were important. This was not tactical training. It was just how my brain was organized. We reached Shelter Station 4 in 90 seconds. I counted cadets going through the door, 12, 14, 17, and then GRX was not there. I turned around. GRX was 20 feet back in the corridor, alone, which was the worst place a Korathi could be. Hive-adjacent species, as I said. What I had not yet fully understood was what happened to Korathi cognitive function when interference cut them off from shared signal. And the simulation's atmospheric systems created exactly that kind of interference. GRX was standing in the corridor with their hands pressed flat against the wall, all 3 of their internal entities trying to speak at once, producing a sound that was less like a voice and more like static. I went back. The pressure was lower out there, 4% below standard. My ears were ringing faintly. The temperature had dropped 2 degrees. Fine, honestly. The kind of conditions where a coat would be nice, not the kind where you were in danger. I crouched in front of GRX. Hey, I said. We, the signal is, GRX's voice skipped like a scratched recording. Their eyes were tracking 3 different directions at once. I sat down on the floor of the corridor. During a Class 3 atmospheric simulation drill, at 3 in the morning, I sat cross-legged on the corridor floor and I started talking. I talked about nothing important, about the intake coffee and how genuinely terrible it was, about the medbot flagging my bone density like I had personally offended it, about Owen at the check-in desk and his long typing pause when he saw my name. Small things, specific things, ordinary things delivered in a voice that said, "This is fine, this is manageable, nothing here requires alarm." I do not know the science of why this works. I know that it does, because it always has, because I grew up in rooms where the thing that kept people from unraveling was someone nearby who was not unraveling. You do not fight it by numbing it. You stay in the room and act like Tuesday. After about 3 minutes, GRX's voice stopped skipping. "We hear you," GRX said. "Good," I said. "We are partially reconverging." "Take your time," I said. "The signal interference is." "I know, it will lift when we get to the shelter. Can you walk?" GRX looked at me. All three of their internal entities focused for a moment on the same direction. "You sat on the floor," they said, "during a drill." "The floor seemed like the right call," I said. "Let's move." We got to Shelter Station 4. I counted everyone in, 17 cadets. Vreth was already there, standing near the environmental control panel with a portable tablet making notes. They looked up when I came in, then at the tablet, then back at me. They said nothing. The simulation ended at 0430. All clear tone, 3 ascending notes, pressure normalizing. The Velhari cadets exhaled together. Oleth, who had managed the pressure drop by going completely still and focusing on the ventilation panel with what I was learning, was their version of centering, slowly released the edge of the bench they had been gripping. I sat in the corner. The nutrition dispenser in Shelter 4 had been knocked sideways by the pressure change. Not damaged, just tilted, leaking a thin stream of orange synth protein in a slow, steady line down its front panel, making a very small, very orange puddle on an otherwise perfectly functional shelter station floor. It was bothering me considerably more than the drill had. I found a utility rag in the emergency kit and cleaned it up. SSN watched me do this with the expression of someone who had found something unexpected in the data they were reviewing. After the drill ended, they came and sat beside me with the focused look they got when a biochemical reading was producing a result they could not account for. "Your stress response during the pressure event," SSN said. "I could not locate it." "The drill was fine," I said. 4% pressure variance. 31-degree temperature differential at the junction point. 2 Velhari cadets required evacuation assistance. "Sure," I said. "And you were," SSN paused, "annoyed about the dispenser." I looked at the synth protein dispenser, still slightly tilted even after I had cleaned the floor. I would file a maintenance report in the morning. "It was making a mess," I said. SSN was quiet for a long time. "How," SSN finally said, "do you do that?" "Do what?" "Stay even during." I thought about how to answer that. I thought about the Lake Erie winters and the Class Red Air days and the factory incident, and all the years of my body learning that alarm was a renewable resource, and running out of it entirely was a luxury you could not afford. "I don't know," I said. "It is just how I am." Not a satisfying answer. I knew it wasn't. I gave it anyway because it was the true one. The next morning, I submitted a formal maintenance report about the atmospheric simulation temperature in the recovery period. The post-drill conditions had dropped to 4 degrees below standard. Survivable, no question. Not dangerous by any metric, but cold. I complained about it in writing, with the reference number properly formatted and the time logged. Vreth read the complaint. According to Owen at the check-in desk, who had heard it from a tech on Deck 3 who was present when it happened, Vreth read the complaint twice, set it down, and sat very still for about 30 seconds before filing a note in my cadet record. I do not know what the note said. I suspect it said something about the temperature complaint. It would have been the most useful data point from the whole drill. By the 4th week, people were placing bets on me. Not on my grades. I was averaging middle of the pack on tactical theory, slightly above on physical modules, unremarkable on navigation. Standard. Nothing to study. GRX, who had developed a somewhat unsettling investment in tracking my daily performance, was not concerned with the academic record. They were placing bets on what I would do next. The odds were listed on a shared data pad that circulated during evening study hours. Top of the list that week, Galactic will file another temperature complaint by Wednesday. Current odds, 2-1 in favor. I filed it on Tuesday. GRX collected whatever the Korathi equivalent of currency was. I did not acknowledge the betting system. This was because acknowledging it would have required me to explain that the temperature in the post-exercise recovery area was genuinely, measurably, unnecessarily cold. And I had already made this argument twice, and nobody had found it compelling. The survival skills module started in week 5. The module coordinator was an instructor named Cal Human actually, which still caught me off guard every time I encountered another one at this station, lean and deliberate, with sun-damaged skin that said he had spent real time on actual planets with actual weather. His teaching approach could be summarized as, "Here is a disaster, figure it out." I liked him immediately. The week 5 scenario was simple in structure. You were stranded on a Class 2 hostile environment, temperature oscillating plus or minus 30 degrees on a short cycle, oxygen at 78% standard, communication array damaged, 1 hour to demonstrate survival protocols. Cal put the parameters on the briefing screen and the Velhari cadets went quiet in a specific way, not panicked, not objecting, the quiet of people doing rapid calculations and arriving at numbers they did not like. "Do we get any gear?" someone asked from the second row. "Standard survival kit," Cal said, "in your module brief." I looked at the parameters. 78% oxygen was annoying. 30-degree oscillation was the kind of thing that turned dangerous if you were not actively managing it, but manageable if you were. Not comfortable. Not fun. A Tuesday in the eerie corridor during a bad month. I raised my hand. Cal looked at me, Galactic. "Do we get any gear?" I said, "or are we going full Cleveland?" Cal blinked once. "I don't know what that means," he said. "It means just ourselves and whatever we can find." He tilted his head slightly. "For the purposes of this scenario, you have the standard kit." "Good," I said. 3 Velhari cadets turned to look at me. SS Sen, sitting to my left, made a small note in their data pad that I was fairly certain was about my cortisol levels, which had not moved. The module ran the way modules run. Scenarios, simulations, practical assessments. I moved through them. GRX had begun defaulting to me in the pair exercises since week 3, which had apparently become habitual for reasons GRX explained as, "We are 3 entities. You are functionally 3 entities in baseline stability. We find this compatible." I did not fully understand the reasoning, but I accepted it. Oleth and I had developed a study arrangement by this point. They took the bunk near the window during study hours for photon exposure. I brought the coffee. We worked in silence because neither of us required conversation for company, which was a form of friendship I had always trusted more than the kind that needed constant maintenance. On day 32, Oleth looked up from their data pad and said, "Does your planet try to kill you? As a policy?" I put my coffee down. I thought about it. Genuinely specifically. The air quality alerts, the grid failures, the factory incident, the flooding in the lower districts 2 years before I left, the decade-long drought before that, the general organizing principle of Lake Erie weather, which was, it will be fine until it is not, and then it will not be fine for a while. "Not officially," I said. Oleth held this for a moment, then looked back at their data pad. "That seems like an important distinction," they said. "It is," I agreed. We went back to studying. Week 6, Vreth assigned me temporary squad leader for the navigation module. A 3-day outdoor exercise in the station's external training ring, simulated alien terrain, 8 cadets, 1 objective. Vreth posted the assignment at 0700, and by 0715, 2 Velhari cadets had formally filed objections with the module coordinator. I was present for this. I was getting coffee from the common area, which shared a thin wall with the module office. The objections were reasonable, in the sense that they were clearly presented and followed logical steps. Earth-native cadets were a quota admission program. The program was politically contested. Placing an Earth-native cadet in a leadership role during a graded module could be read as a political statement by the Academy. The objectors were not saying I was unqualified. They were saying my placement was complicated. I poured my second coffee. I heard Vreth through the wall. The assignment stands. I went back to my pod and packed my navigation kit and did not tell anyone I had heard the conversation. Not because it hurt in a sharp way. It was more like an old bruise, one you stop noticing until someone presses on it without meaning to, and then you notice considerably. Different rooms. Same math. The navigation exercise ran 3 days and we finished in 2.5. I will not claim this was because I was a brilliant squad leader. It was because I am constitutionally unable to be at ease with a timeline that has room to spare, a habit from a place where slack had consequences. We moved faster than the expected pace, made fewer stops, and I made 3 decisions during the exercise that Cal later described as tactically unconventional but defensible. One of those decisions was to cross a terrain section rated as high stability risk rather than go around it, because the long route added 4 hours and I had reviewed the stability data and decided the risk sat within acceptable limits. It was. We crossed in 11 minutes. SSN walked beside me and said nothing during the crossing, which I appreciated. On the other side, they said, "Your acceptable parameters are different from standard." "I know," I said. "That is not a criticism," SSN said. "I know that too," I said. The 2 Velhari cadets who had filed the objection completed the exercise without incident and filed nothing further. They did not apologize, and I did not expect them to. On the last evening, one of them, Isha, precise and exacting in the way of someone who had come up through a very rigorous academic background, came and sat across from me at the evening meal. "You read the terrain data before the crossing," Isha said. "Yes," I said. "Not the summary, the full data set." The summary was 22 lines. The full data was 90. The difference was in the subsurface density readings, which the summary had averaged out. Isha was quiet. "How did you know to look there?" "Experience," I said. "What experience?" "The terrain was simulated." "Not experience with this terrain," I said. "Experience with data that has been averaged to look simpler than it is." Isha held this for a moment. Something in their expression shifted slightly, like a calibration running behind their eyes. They went back to their meal without another word. That night, SSN told me, in the careful way they delivered things they found emotionally complicated, that during the crossing, they had read my biochemistry. And I said, "You were calm," SSN said. "Genuinely calm, not managed, not suppressed, actually calm." "Okay," I said. "It frightened the other cadets," SSN said. I sat with that for a moment. I thought about a person standing steady inside a hard thing, and another person watching that steadiness and finding it stranger than the hard thing itself. "It always does," I said. I was not certain by the end of that sentence who I was talking about. The cadets on the crossing, the neighbors back home who had watched my father stay level while things around him went wrong, me, at 16, watching him do it. Something about the ceiling of the barracks pod deserved a long look after that. The yogurt situation remained unresolved. On day 40, a clearly labeled container with my name on it disappeared from the communal cooling unit for the 3rd time, and I went to the common area and stood in front of the unit for 90 seconds without moving, looking at the empty shelf where it had been. Giarix came in for an evening snack, saw me standing there, and quietly backed out. I filed a report with the barracks coordinator, itemized, with the previous 2 incidents referenced by date and a request for a lock on my assigned shelf space. The coordinator processed it within the hour. Vreth, who reviewed all barracks incident reports as a matter of standard practice, read this 1-3 times according to Owen, who had this from a tech on Deck 3 who was in the office when it happened. Nobody touched my yogurt after that. The collision happened at 14:23 on a Thursday. I know this because I was in tactical theory class on Deck 6 when the first alert tone hit, a double pulse, low tone I had not heard during any drill or simulation in the 6 weeks I had been at the station. A new sound. My brain cross-referenced it automatically. Not atmospheric, not fire, not medical. Hull impact. I closed my data pad. The instructor, a Velhari officer named Teth, stopped mid-sentence and checked their console. Their expression did not change, which told me more than the alarm did. Teth was the kind of instructor who expressed alarm freely during simulations. The fact that they were not expressing it now meant they were past the alarm stage and into something more serious. All cadets, Teth said, are to proceed to. The lights went red. Not the amber of a simulation, red. The second alert tone started. This one I knew. It was the atmospheric failure sequence, a distinct tone for each consecutive deck losing standard pressure. I heard Deck 5, then Deck 6. Our deck. Teth said, move now. The class moved. I moved with it, but not in the same direction. While 12 other cadets headed for the main corridor toward the shelter stations, I went to the back wall where the emergency system panel was mounted, and I pulled it open. The shelter station protocol directed everyone to sealed, reinforced shelter during an atmospheric event. Correct procedure. I had no argument with it. What I had was a list in my head of who was where on this deck at 14:23 on a Thursday. Oaleth had a solo study period in the Deck 6 resource room, at the far end of the corridor from the shelter station. In a standard atmospheric failure, the pressure would equalize within the corridor sections once the seals engaged. In a hull impact with a possible breach, the corridor seals might not engage correctly. I checked the panel. The pressure readings for Corridor 6 East, where the resource room was, were already dropping. Not catastrophic, not yet. I closed the panel and went the wrong direction. The corridor was empty by the time I hit the junction. Everyone else was already moving toward the shelter. The air felt different out there, not dangerous thin, but thinner, the kind you notice at around 30 seconds of steady movement. I moved faster. The resource room door was sealed. Emergency lock, automatic, triggered by the pressure alert. I put my access card against the panel. Denied shelter protocol overrode standard access. I looked at the door. I looked at the panel components around it. I grew up in a district where the building infrastructure was 40 years old and maintained with whatever the city could afford, which was never quite enough. I knew how emergency locks worked. Not from any course. From being the kind of person who learned how things functioned, because knowing was the difference between stuck and not stuck. I opened the maintenance access cover beside the door. Inside were the relay connections for the door's power and lock system. The lock's secondary release was a mechanical lever. It existed for exactly this scenario, for a person who needed to override the automated system for a legitimate reason. I had a legitimate reason. I pulled the lever. The door opened in 12 seconds. Oaleth was inside, pressed flat against the wall near the window. The window was not cracked, but it was showing stress lines at the upper right corner, hairline fractures from the impact vibration, the kind that appear before the real problem and are their own kind of message. The room's main lighting had failed. The emergency backup had engaged, producing a low amber glow, and for an Ethani amber emergency lighting in a sealed room with a stressed window was a very specific category of bad. Oaleth's photonic intake was dropping. I could see it in how they were holding themselves, too still, the particular stillness of an Ethani whose energy supply is going in the wrong direction. "I need you to move," I said. "The window," Oleth's voice was slower than usual, lower. "I know, away from it first, then we deal with the rest." "The lighting." "I know that too." I got Oleth away from the window and looked at the emergency lighting panel. The backup system was running on standard amber spectrum, designed for human and Velhari visibility under emergency protocol, not calibrated for Ethani photosynthetic absorption. The station's maintenance kit was in a locker next to the door. I had seen its contents listed in the Deck 6 emergency prep document, which I had read on my third day because I read those documents. The kit contained broad-spectrum LED strip lights, intended for emergency signaling and location marking, wrong wavelength for optimal Ethani photonic use, wrong intensity calibration entirely. I pulled them out anyway. I spliced the strips into the room's main power circuit, using connections rated for exactly one of the two jobs I was making them do. The wiring was incorrect in 3 specific ways I was fully aware of and comfortable with, because the ways it was wrong were wrong in directions that would not cause a short, and what I needed was not elegant wiring. I needed light. The strips came on, too bright. They hummed at a frequency that made my back teeth ache, the wrong color for any room anyone had intentionally decorated. Oleth stood in them and breathed. After about 40 seconds, the stillness in their posture eased. Color came back into their skin. "The light is wrong," Oleth said. "It's working," I said. "It is angry," they said. "It is," I agreed. "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Then let's go." We moved toward Shelter Station 6 West, the nearest one still showing a green seal status on my emergency map. At the junction in Corridor 6 Central, I found GRX. On the floor. Not injured, I checked that first. Breathing, responsive to visual contact, no visible damage. But their eyes were moving in 3 directions at once, and their voice was producing the static sound I had heard in the first drill, the one that was not quite a voice. The collision had knocked out a relay on Deck 6 that included the Hive signal amplifier assigned to GRX's pod, separated from shared signal by hardware failure. Oleth needed to keep moving to stay stable. I told them to continue to the shelter station. I sat down on the floor of Corridor 6 Central. There was a crack in the viewport at the far end of the corridor, small 2 inches, maybe 3, in the impact-resistant glass, structurally non-critical at the current pressure differential. The math said it was fine. I kept looking at it anyway every few seconds, running the same calculation, coming up with the same answer, looking again. I talked to GRX. I talked about the navigation exercise, the terrain crossing, the subsurface density readings, and what they looked like when you read the full data instead of the average summary. I talked through the inventory of the Deck 6 maintenance kit from memory, item by item. I talked about the coffee and how it had not improved in 6 weeks, and how I had made peace with the fact that it was not going to. I was afraid. I want to say that plainly. The alarm was real. The crack in the viewport was real. The pressure variance was real, and Oleth fatting in an amber-lit room had been real, and GRX on the floor in 3-way cognitive failure was real, and somewhere on this deck were other cadets I had not located yet, and a hull impact whose full extent I did not know. I was afraid in a way that was specific and immediate and not at all abstract. What I was not going to do was let GRX feel it. GRX needed someone in the corridor whose body said, "This is manageable, this is known, stay with me." So that was what my body said. After 4 minutes, GRX began to reconverge. "You are talking about coffee," GRX said. "I am," I said. "The signal is still weak." "I know, the relay is down, it will come back, you are okay." "We are 3/4 present." "3/4 is enough," I said. "Get up." GRX stood, not steady but standing. I put my shoulder under their arm and we moved. Shelter Station 6 West had 15 cadets inside when we arrived. Vreth was already there, which told me Vreth had been doing the same thing I was doing, moving through the deck, checking, counting, solving. Vreth looked at me when I came in with GRX. Then they looked at the time stamp on their tablet. Then back at me. "Oleth is stable," I said. "Arrived 4 minutes ago. Photon stable. Your wiring is an administrative issue for a different day." "Sure," I said. "Deck 5 shelter is sealed. Deck 7 shelter is sealed. We are the last." I counted the cadets in the shelter. 15, plus Vreth plus me plus GRX. 18. 18 cadets in this cohort. I sat down on the nearest bench. GRX sat next to me, still at roughly 3/4 function, which meant present enough to be uncomfortable and not present enough to mask it. SSN came and crouched in front of me. "You were afraid," SSN said. The first time they had ever said it directly, not as a clinical reading, a direct statement. "Yeah," I said. "I felt it when I passed you in the corridor with GRX." SSN's voice was careful, the way it was when something did not fit the categories they had built. "It was real." "It was," I said. "But you..." "Yeah," I said. SSN did not push on it further. I did not pull it out any further. In the space between those two things, the actual content of the conversation sat, and we both knew it was there, and we left it there. The all-clear came 53 minutes later. Hull breach contained. Atmospheric systems stabilizing. No casualties. Full structural assessment to follow. Vreth's count, 18 cadets accounted for. 0 injuries. 3 non-standard equipment uses. Full incident report to follow. I looked at the crack in the viewport on the shelter's observation feed. Still there 2 inches, maybe 3. The repair crew would get to it. I looked away. The review board met on a Tuesday, which felt appropriate. The hearing room was on Deck 2, which had been unaffected by the impact. It had the particular atmosphere of rooms where official things happen, good lighting, even temperature, a table long enough that the people on the other side seemed farther away than they were. There was a potted plant at the center of the table, an Ethani design preference, according to the briefing Owen had quietly handed me that morning. 3 Ethani on the board, 2 Velhari, 1 human. The plant was the Ethani members' adjustment to the room. I looked at the plant when I sat down. It was a perfectly reasonable plant. It had done nothing wrong. I kept looking at it anyway, because the alternative was looking at the 6 people on the other side of the table who were deciding what to do with my record, and the plant was a considerably more comfortable place to rest my eyes. The subjects for review, the board was careful not to call them charges, were 3. First, unauthorized access override to the resource room on Deck 6, which constituted a departure from the Shelter First protocol. Second, unauthorized modification of the room's electrical system using non-rated components. Third, unauthorized physical assistance to Cadet GRX of the Korathi cohort in a manner that delayed my own arrival at the shelter station by 19 minutes. The third one was my favorite. "You have reviewed the incident report," said the board lead. A Velhari named As, formal and measured, the kind of official who asked questions they already knew the answers to because the record mattered. "I have," I said. "You understand the Shelter First protocol?" "Yes." "And you departed from it deliberately?" "Yes." As made a note. "Can you explain your reasoning?" I explained it. I laid it out the way Cal had taught us, what data I had, what the estimated outcomes were, what the risk calculation looked like. Oleth's location, the pressure readings in Corridor 6 East, the lighting failure, and what it meant for an Ethani in a sealed room with a stressed viewport. I explained why the standard protocol would not have produced a good outcome for Oleth specifically. I delivered it in the flat, specific voice of someone reporting a set of facts. The board listened. Then they called SS Sen. SS Sen sat in the witness position to my left and gave their account with the methodical precision of a species that read biochemical data for a living and understood the difference between what a person said and what a person was experiencing while they said it. SS Sen described the first atmospheric drill. SS Sen described the navigation exercise. SS Sen described the corridor and GRX on the floor and the shelter count at the end. In your assessment, Oz said, was Cadet Kowalczyk's behavior during the emergency consistent with her previous behavior pattern? Yes, SS Sen said. And how would you characterize that pattern? She responds to crisis the way other beings respond to routine, SS Sen said. Her fear state was present during the emergency. I am certain of this, but it did not affect her function. A pause. I have no clinical framework for it. I believe it is structural. I believe she was built this way. The room was quiet for a moment. One of the Ethani board members, a thin, precise woman named Ara, leaned slightly forward. Built by what? By her origin environment, SS Sen said. By a planet that does not allow its inhabitants to be incapacitated by fear for very long. Ara looked at me, not unkindly, the way you look at something genuinely interesting. I looked at the plant. GRX testified next. Korathi testimony required a translation adjunct because of the plural voice structure, and the board had arranged one. Partway through, however, GRX's three entities reached consensus and spoke as one voice, which the translation adjunct noted in the record as significant. Apparently this had not occurred in a formal testimony setting before. What GRX said, translated and condensed, was this. She sat on the floor of a damaged corridor during a hull breach and talked about coffee until we reconverged. Is that an accurate summary? Oz asked. GRX looked at me, all three entities at once one direction. She talked about coffee, GRX said, and about data readings, and about a place called Cleveland. We do not know where that is, but she sat down and she was not afraid in the way that would have made it worse, and that helped us. Oz wrote this down. The record shows, Oz said, that you previously stated you would follow her again. We would, GRX said. We do not fully understand why, but yes. Oaleth's testimony was brief. Oaleth sat in the witness position with the composed bearing of an Ethani who had decided exactly what they were going to say and was going to say it without elaboration. The resource room lights failed, Oaleth said. She built me light from components that were not designed to build it. The light was technically incorrect, wrong wavelength for optimal photonic absorption, wrong intensity calibration, wrong mounting entirely. It was built incorrectly and it kept me functional. Would standard emergency protocol have? The board's human member, a man named Leo, began. I would have been unconscious within 11 minutes in that room, Oaleth said. Standard protocol directed all cadets to the shelter station. I could not reach the shelter station. The protocol had no provision for my specific situation. A pause. Mara had a provision. What provision? Leo asked. She looked at what was in the room, Oaleth said, and she built it. Oaleth stood. They had said what they came to say. They sat back down. Cal testified after that. His was the shortest. He gave the timeline on the bypass operation, 12 seconds, mechanism correct, non-destructive, fully reversible. He gave the assessment of the electrical modification, components used, connections made, structural safety review. Then he said, Cadets are trained to perform the bypass operation Kowalczyk used in approximately 6 minutes. This is the drill standard. She performed it in 12 seconds. When I asked her about it afterward, she said she learned the relevant system from growing up in a district with 40-year-old building infrastructure. Leo looked up from his notes. She was not trained to perform it. Not by us, Cal said. Vreth testified last. Vreth sat across from the board with the stillness of someone who had prepared every word and was going to deliver it at exactly the pace they chose. They laid out the incident data, timestamps, pressure readings, shelter station sequence, cadet locations, confirmed outcomes. Clean and precise. In your assessment, Oz said, was Cadet Kowalczyk's departure from shelter protocol a violation or an adaptive response? Both, Vreth said. Oz waited. She violated the protocol, Vreth said. The protocol was not written with her specific capability set in mind. This is not a criticism of the protocol. It was written to produce the best outcome for the range of cadets it anticipated. She is outside that range in ways the protocol has not yet accounted for. A pause. If she had followed it, Cadet Oleth would have been unconscious in 11 minutes. Cadet Giarix would have remained non-functional without outside stabilization. The shelter count would have been 17. And instead, Leo said. 18, Vreth said. The room held that number. Your recommendation, Oz said. Commendation, Vreth said, and a review of current difficulty benchmarks for Class 3 training scenarios. Another pause, the kind where a person is deciding whether to include an off-the-record observation in an official statement. They included it. She filed a temperature complaint the morning after the first atmospheric drill, about the cold in the post-drill recovery period. I recommend it be included in the record. Leo frowned slightly. Why? Because it is the most accurate data point in her entire cadet file, Vreth said. The drill produced no measurable stress response. The temperature produced a formal written complaint. The metrics we are using to evaluate cadet performance did not capture anything meaningful about her. The temperature complaint did. Vreth stood. The current system measures survival, Vreth said. It does not measure humans. They sat down. I had been watching the plant through all of it. It was a good plant. It was doing its job, which was to exist in a formal room and be green and help the Ethani board members feel that the space was appropriately calibrated for a productive hearing. It had not moved. It had not made anything worse. In the context of a review board proceeding, it was the most professionally neutral entity in the room. I respected that considerably. The board recessed for deliberation. I sat in the hallway outside with Owen, who had appeared at some point during the morning and had positioned himself nearby in the way of someone who was not officially present but was not going anywhere. How do you think it went? Owen said. I think the plan helped, I said. Owen looked at me. The one on the table, I said. The Ethani board members calibrate to spaces that include organic elements. Calmer board members reason better. Owen appeared to consider this. That is not quite what I meant. I know, I said. The ventilation grill across the corridor was the standard station issue type, the kind you stop registering after the first week because they are everywhere. I had cataloged the ones on Deck 4 within 3 days of arrival and knew which ones had slight airflow variations that indicated pressure readings in adjacent compartments. Old habit. Are you worried? Owen said. The honest answer was complicated. A review board could adjust my record. It could recommend disciplinary action. In a bad outcome, it could end my candidacy entirely. These were real consequences, and they sat in my chest with the weight of real consequences. But they were also a room full of people deciding things through a process, and a process could be followed and engaged and reasoned with. That was already more than you got from a grid failure in a Lake Erie January. A little, I said. Owen nodded and did not comment further, which was why I had come to appreciate him. SSN came around the corner and sat on my other side. They had clearly been waiting nearby and had not wanted to be visible about it. This was a Velhari consideration. They were always careful about how their empathic presence came across in close quarters. You were afraid in there, SSN said. A little, I said. Not like the corridor. No, I said. The corridor and the boardroom, SSN said carefully. You are more afraid of the boardroom. Yes, I said. Why? I thought about GRX pulling back together on a corridor floor, Oaleth standing in wrong spectrum light stabilizing, the shelter count, 18. In the corridor, I said, I could do something. SSN understood this. I watched it move across their features, not quickly, but visibly, the way understanding arrived in a Velhari face. You trust yourself in a crisis, SSN said. I trust myself in a crisis, I said. I do not know if I trust institutions to see what that is worth. A longer silence. Different rooms, SSN said, same math. I looked at them. You said that once, SSN said. In the shelter during the drill to yourself. I do not think you knew it came out. I had not known. The board recalled us after 40 minutes. Vreth was standing at the back of the room when I walked in, not at the table, not in a witness seat. Just there. Present. This told me something I chose not to examine too closely. Os laid out the findings. The resource room access was reclassified from protocol violation to field adaptive emergency response under incomplete situational data. The electrical modification was reclassified as improvised engineering, non-standard but structurally sound and outcome effective. The delay in reaching the shelter was noted as a direct consequence of the adaptive response and carried no separate finding. Commendation approved. Vreth's recommendation for difficulty benchmark review, forwarded to the Training Module Committee for assessment. Cadet Kowalczyk, Os said, do you have anything to add to the record? I looked at the plant one final time. It had been through an entire hearing. It was still green, still in its place, still doing exactly what it had come here to do. No, I said. Then, because I had been thinking about it since Vreth said it in testimony, I said, actually. Os waited. The temperature complaint, I said, the one from after the first drill. Yes. The recovery period dropped to 4 degrees below standard. Survivable, not dangerous. But it was cold, and it did not need to be that cold. When the benchmarks are reviewed, I would like that to be on the record. The training scenarios can be difficult without being cold for no reason. Leo made a note. He was smiling slightly, not the kind that meant he found it amusing, but the kind that meant something had landed exactly as intended. Based on the angle, I decided it was both at once. Noted, Os said. I walked out into the corridor. Owen was already gone, back to his desk. SS Sen and GRX and Oaleth were all waiting outside, which they had clearly arranged beforehand and were now trying to look like they had not arranged. Well, GRX said. Cleared, I said, commendation. GRX made a sound that was. SS Sen later told me. The Korathi equivalent of a satisfied exhale delivered simultaneously across 3 separate voices. Oaleth said, good. Like the outcome had never been in question and the entire hearing had been a formality the universe was obligated to complete before reaching the obvious conclusion. It was the most Oaleth thing they had ever said. SS Sen looked at me for a moment with the expression they wore when they were reading something complicated in a person's biochemistry. You are relieved, SS Sen said. I am, I said. And something else. I thought about the different rooms and the same math, and the process that could be engaged and reasoned with, and the board that had looked at the evidence and reached the correct conclusion. Surprised, I said. That they reached the right decision. I considered that. That I believed they would, I said. We went to the common area. I got the coffee. GRX collected from what I was now certain was an ongoing betting pool, because they had the manner of someone who had placed a wager with confidence and was now receiving their return. I did not acknowledge this, because acknowledging it would have started a conversation that required energy I did not have. Oaleth sat near the window in the afternoon light. which was not built from wrong components, which did not hum at an unpleasant frequency, which was just light arriving the way it was supposed to. That night I wrote home. I sat in the porthole chair on deck 4 with the stars filling the window, and I wrote a single paragraph that said, "Weather is fine up here. Food is okay. Made some friends." I sent it. My mother wrote back in 11 minutes, which told me she had been watching the message thread. The reply said, "Are you eating enough? The news here said there was some kind of incident at your station. We saw it. Are you all right?" I read it twice. I thought about the corridor, the crack in the viewport, GRX on the floor and OLETH in the amber light, and the wrong spectrum strips humming in my back teeth, and SSN reading my fear in the hallway and not looking away from it. I thought about GRX saying, in formal testimony in front of a review board, that she sat on the floor and talked about coffee and we reconverged. I thought about my father, who had stayed level in rooms that did not deserve it, who had taught me by example and not instruction that steadiness was not the absence of fear. It was the decision to be useful anyway. He had never explained this. He had just done it consistently until I understood it as a fact about how people could be. I wrote back, "Everything is fine. They gave me a commendation. The coffee up here is terrible, but I have stopped expecting it to improve." I sat with the stars for a while after that. The station hummed around me, pressurized, controlled, safe by every reading on every panel. The galaxy had looked at me like I was the unusual one. Maybe I was. Maybe a person whose body said this is manageable in the middle of a hull breach was not the standard version of a thing. Maybe growing up somewhere that was actively difficult had produced something that looked like bravery from the outside and felt, from the inside, more like just the way Tuesday worked. But here were 18 cadets in the shelter count. Here was OLETH in the good light. Here was GRX collecting their winnings from a betting pool. Here was SSN, 3 bunks away, who had read my fear and stayed in the room with it and named it to my face and not once looked away from it. That seemed like enough. I went to bed. The yogurt in the communal cooling unit, clearly labeled, assigned shelf, locked, was exactly where I had left it. One small, specific, fully one thing in a station full of larger ones. I was fine with that. That was just the job.